Good evening and welcome to the fourth and final installment of our Rallying Together series at Randolph School. I'm Adam Dubé, head of school here at Randolph. Throughout February, we've been exploring various aspects of our school and ways to celebrate and support all the members of our community. This past fall, Randolph School established a strategic committee that's been focused on the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our school, in keeping with our mission of seeking truth, building character, and nurturing all. Tonight, it's our pleasure to have Ambassador Reuben E. Brigety II join us to share about his work at Sewanee University, as well as the work of his career. Ambassador Brigety is Sewanee University's 17th Vice-Chancellor and President. He is a native Southerner whose life and distinguished career have taken him from the U.S. Naval Academy to the University of Cambridge and from Africa to Washington, D.C. He is a former dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University and former U.S. Ambassador to the African Union. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and holds a master's degree in philosophy and a PhD in international relations from the University of Cambridge. He has served as an adjunct senior fellow for African Peace and Security at the Council on Foreign Relations and as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of African Affairs. He has also served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, where he supervised U.S. refugee programs in Africa. He's a member of the American Academy of Diplomacy, a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and a recipient of the Council's International Affairs Fellowship. On a personal note, a number of us had the opportunity to hear Ambassador Brigety speak as the opening keynote speaker for the Southern Association of Independent Schools Conference last fall. And we were inspired by both his courage and his candor in speaking hard truths while expressing optimism for the future. Ambassador Brigety, welcome.
Adam, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
We've asked our community to submit some questions in advance, and some of these are based on the reading and the sermon that you shared, while others are related to your work at Sewanee and throughout your career. Before we get to those, however, I'm wondering if you could just take a few minutes to share with us a little bit about your journey, how you came to your current position as Vice-Chancellor and President at Sewanee, and the work in which you've been engaged since arriving there.
Sure. Well, first of all, good evening to everybody. I can't see you, but I trust that you are numerous in your number. And it's an honor for me to spend some time with you this evening. First of all, let me make a correction, which may seem ever so slight to you, but is of enormous importance to people in my world. And that is the name of our university. We are not Sewanee University. We are the University of the South, Sewanee.
Okay.
Why does that matter? Because when word got out that the University of the South had picked this guy, Brigety, to be their 17th Vice Chancellor, who also happened to be their first African-American Vice Chancellor, a certain portion of the Sewanee-verse, as I like to call it, exploded in anxiety. What's this guy going to do? He's going to change the name. He's going to change the name of the university. He's going to call it Wakanda University and build the Malcolm X Center for Revolution and Reparations right in the center of campus. No. So I had to make clear, just in case anybody ever has any doubt, we are not changing the name. We are still proudly the University of the South. And we are changing the meaning of the name.
Great. That's good. So I didn't mean to reinforce that.
No, it's fine. But it gives an interesting segue, so I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And when I say we're changing the meaning of the name, so the University of the South was founded initially in 1858 by Episcopal churchmen, and they were all men at the time, on a mountaintop between what is now Chattanooga and Nashville. And it was founded to create a center for learning here in the American South, so that sons, and they were all sons at the time, wouldn't have to go so far north to get educated. But also, crucially, it was founded to support the interests of the slaveholding class in the American South. In fact, it is the only university in the United States that was created explicitly, black letter, for the purpose of advancing the superiority of a slaveholding culture and the ideology of white supremacy underlying it.
Wow.
And then the Civil War happened. And then in 1868, it was refounded. And for a century, was explicitly, as the historical research tells us, fashioned to be a, quote, child of the Confederacy. And as such was a keeper of the flame of the lost cause for 100 years. Wow. And thus, both because until very recently, to be Southern, explicitly, was meant to be born south of the Mason-Dixon line, to be white, usually to be Protestant, and to be an apologist for, or at least agnostic about the lost cause. Mm-hmm. We are now affirmatively no longer the University of the Old Confederacy, but the University of the New South. Mm-hmm. The South that embraces all of its history, that tells it all, and that derives from both the complexity, the pain, and the beauty of that collective history. A full understanding of all those who have made contributions to this most eclectic region of our country. Mm-hmm. I would often, as an American ambassador, would often tell interlocutors, foreign interlocutors, that you can't understand America unless you understand the American South. You can't understand jazz. You can't understand rock and roll. You can't understand contemporary American politics. You can't understand why the South still calls itself the South. Not in the South, but the South. Right. You can't understand the nature of our electoral. So many things you can't understand. You can't understand amongst the best of American contemporary literature without understanding the titanic forces that made the South. Yeah. And that made people in the South that went on to contribute to the greatness of America and beyond. And so when I was completing my term as Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, which is right in the middle of downtown Washington, I could have kicked a football from my office and hit the State Department.
Easily. The
White House. And after you've been dean of a place like that for 5 years and you haven't been fired, people start to call you and say, what are you interested in doing next? And so I'd been in discussions with, several places. And then Sewanee came a calling. And I'm a native of Jacksonville, Florida, which is very much the South. Thank you very much.
Yeah. It is Florida, but it's...
Yeah, it's North Florida, right?
Yeah.
So basically in Florida, the further south you go, the further north you get.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I knew of Sewanee, but the first thing I asked the search firm was, are they ready for a black president? Because if they're not ready, I'm not coming.
Yeah.
They said, no, we think they're ready. And the second question I asked was, fine, so are you just calling me because you need to diversify your candidate pool? Because I've been in that boat too, and I've got other things to do.
Sure.
They said, no, we think your qualifications are fine. And so I entered a conversation that took several months. And the more I learned about Sewanee, the more I felt like I got it. As I say, I was born and raised in the American South. My father went to Morehouse undergrad. He was the first African-American to graduate from the University of Florida Medical School in 1970.
Okay.
My mother went to Florida A&M. I was steeped growing up, both by forced readings from my parents, but also talking with my relatives, steeped in the history of the American Civil Rights Movement, not only just academically, but also through our own familial lineage. And I grew up in a place that had 4 of its public high schools named after Confederate generals.
Yeah.
Including Nathaniel Bedford Forrest High School, who was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan.
Right. Wow.
And this is like the late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah. And
so I understood the complexities of being a Southerner. I understood the Oxford and Cambridge roots that also are deeply embedded here in Sewanee because of when the university was refounded in 1868. It was done with the support from benefactors from both Oxford and Cambridge. I understood the importance of a liberal arts education, given my own experience as a dean of the Elliott School, which is a multidisciplinary international affairs school. I understood and fell in love with the beautiful natural environment here in Sewanee. I'm an outdoorsman myself. I'm a active adult scout leader. I do a lot of hiking. Just came from an overnight camp out this past weekend where it was 23 degrees overnight.
That's great. Those are the best ones.
Exactly. And I'm also an equestrian.
Oh,
And Sewanee has superb equestrian facilities. And when I saw the barn, I was like, sold. I'm coming.
nice. Do you have your own horse?
I don't know. I lease a couple,
Okay.
but I don't have my own. That's a whole other conversation.
Sure. Yeah.
And so it was with great both gratitude and a serious, profound sense of history. But on February 28th, 2020, last year, the last day of Black History Month, my wife and I were introduced to the Sewanee community, after I'd been newly elected by the Board of Trustees to be the 17th Vice-Chancellor. We came back to Sewanee floating on air,
Yeah.
and then the world exploded.
Yeah. Very much so.
The coronavirus pandemic clearly took hold about 2 weeks later. So I now knew I had to not only be a new university president, but try to figure out how we would return students to classes in the midst of a global pandemic of what was clearly becoming biblical proportions.
Mm-hmm.
And then George Floyd was killed under the knee of a police officer in Minneapolis who squeezed the life out of him over the course of 8 minutes and 46 seconds while he screamed for his dead mama.
Mm-hmm.
And then the world exploded in unprecedented, spontaneous social protest demanding that everybody be treated equally and with dignity and decency regardless of their race. So now I knew I had to come into being the first African-American vice-chancellor of the only university in America that was founded for the purpose of advancing the interests of slaveholding culture in the midst of a global pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen in a century.
Nothing like stacking problems.
Right?
Yeah.
So, at least there wasn't a zombie apocalypse.
But it's still early.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
It's only Wednesday.
Yeah,
or Tuesday.
exactly.
And so I'll just kind of wrap a bow around this so we can go straight to the Q&A. And so since I've been here at Sewanee, we have been heavily involved, in addition to the kind of just the blocking and tackling of keeping a university opening in the pandemic, in an exercise to clearly face and confront our past so that we can boldly chart our future, where we are asserting that we are a place where everyone is treated with dignity and decency, where, given the instructions I have from our Board of Regents, where we are to become a place that is a model for diversity and equity and inclusion in American higher education, and a center for truth and reconciliation on matters of race in the American South. And doing all of that so that we can pursue our core mission of helping young adults become people of character and consequence, ready to go on and be change agents in the world.
Yeah, that's great. I mentioned when we spoke previously, we've had a number of students who have attended the University of the South, and I think the values that you're enumerating are very much the values that we have as a school. And so knowing that they have those opportunities, when they leave here, and that there are organizations that align with that, I think it's very important. But I wanted to go back to something you said. You used a phrase you said the complexities of being a Southerner. Now I am not a native Southerner. I wonder if you could tell me, if you could just say a little bit more about what do you mean about the complexities of being a Southerner, and how does that play itself out on the campus there at the University of the South?
Here's a book that I would commend to you and your colleagues, written a few years ago. It's called The New Mind of the South, written by a woman named Tracy Thompson. Mm-hmm. The New Mind of the South, if you've not read it already.
I haven't.
And Ms. Thompson was a native of Atlanta, from a middle-class family, and went off after college up to Washington, where she became a reporter for the Washington Post for many years. But kept feeling that the sense of the South kept calling her. And it wasn't just the general nostalgia that anybody would have for her home or from where they grew up, but of this notion of what does it mean to be Southern just wouldn't quit her, as it were. And the New Mind of the South explores this unfolding tension between a region whose economy and culture depended on chattel slavery, and subsequently after that, on perpetuating a social order that by law and by custom, privileged white people and subjugated Black people, often brutally, until until the second emancipation, starting with the late 1960s and continuing thereafter. And as one grapples with that reality and the historical legacy that derives from that in the context of a region of the country that is becoming increasingly more diverse ethnically, and where those who were separated by law and custom in a strict hierarchy now are engaging each other as equals. Let me kind of give you a sense of historical perspective on what that means. You and I were just talking before we started. We're about the same age.
Yeah.
I'm 47. You said you're just about approaching 50.
Yeah.
So
48.
48. So
give myself a couple of years. Yeah.
Exactly. We could have been playing in the sandbox together.
Exactly.
Right? So I was born in 1973, which means that as long as people from Africa have been in the Americas since 1619, I belong to the very first generation of African Americans who were born fully free and equal under the law to all their fellow citizens.
Yeah.
Even those who were born a few years earlier in the late 1960s cannot say the same thing because of laws that were on the books and Supreme Court decisions that are yet to be decided.
Yeah.
And so my view of what is happening now as our country is undergoing the most profound racial reckoning we've done as a society since 1968, is that what is happening right now is at long last a conversation between equals. Of people like me who are of that first generation of equally born, who are now firmly ensconced in middle age, with my trifocal lenses and my, and my orthopedic shoes,
Right.
that know enough about life and have enough station in life that we can actually fully speak our truths without self-censorship, taught to us by our parents, or without a sense of inferiority.
Yeah.
And people younger than you and I, who are in their 20s or so, or in their late teens, your students, all these things we're talking about, these are things that they thought their grandparents had resolved.
Yeah.
So why do we still have to have this conversation? And the short answer is because the continued empirical evidence of our collective lived experience suggests that there's still work to do.
Yeah. You mentioned about young people in your Time magazine article. You said that students today are seeking change, not simply progress. How do you see this shift impacting the work of organizations regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Sure. Well, let me explain what I consider to be the difference between change and progress.
Yeah.
It isn't only a sense of urgency or a sense of timing, because even change takes some time.
Sure.
Right? If I wanted to change my clothes, right, I couldn't say presto and I'd be wearing like a long tie, so I had to take the tie off, put another one on, right?
Yeah.
The fundamental difference between progress and change is how much imperfection you were willing to tolerate
Hmm.
and for how long on the pathway to your goal. Because progress presumes that some level of imperfection is not only tolerable, but expected
Yeah.
as you make your way to a particular goal. My parents, for example, were raised with the idea of racial progress. So they grew up in the Jim Crow South. They went to segregated schools. They had inferior textbooks. They both went to historically Black colleges for undergraduate because basically at the time there's no place in the South essentially where they could go. And my father was amongst the first, vanguard to help integrate institutions of higher learning in the American South. In his case, when he went to medical school at the University of Florida. And so for them, and by the way, if you saw my dad, he would look. If you guys remember that show from like from the '80s, The Jeffersons,
Oh,
like
yeah.
my dad was George Jefferson, like jet, kind of short, kind of
Yeah.
like
Wiry, sort of.
wiry, sparky kind
Yeah.
of personality, whatever, right?
Yeah.
Except he was in Florida and not in Manhattan.
Yeah.
It was a physician and not a dry cleaner.
Not dry cleaner, right.
Exactly. But for them, it was always about progress. So even if, we would get called the N-word driving down the street in Jacksonville, as happened, even if we moved into like George and Wheezy did when they were moving on up, like when my parents bought as a new doctor in town, bought a nice house in a nice neighborhood on the river. It was only the second Black family to move in. And the night they were moving in, white families tried to get them to leave as they were moving in their house because they're afraid they were going to drop their property values, just like in 1977.
Yeah.
At least they were improving. At least there was progress.
Right.
Meaning things weren't as bad as they used to be.
Right.
You still have to put up with it, but it's still as bad as it used to be. And I guess the reason we are saying change, not progress, is because institutionally and in terms of society, we have to be firm about what is absolutely no longer tolerable. Period. And what is affirmatively required for us to make real the beloved community.
Yeah.
In the words of Dr. King.
Right. That's a big challenge for organizations as they're wrestling with the culture within the organization. They're wrestling with the direction and how do they affect that change within the organization. So you take an organization like Sewanee, the University of the South. You take an organization like the University of the South. It's been around, for decades. For almost 2 centuries, right? A century and a half, and trying to affect that type of change and move, especially something that has been a part of that organization, can be very difficult. I'm wondering what advice do you have for organizations? So I mentioned in the opening comments, we have a DEI committee. We've recognized, we've heard from our alums and said, we love Randolph, we love the school. Our experience wasn't always perfect. There are ways that we think the school can be better for every student, and we want that for all of our students at our school. We want that for all of our families at our school, for all of our faculty and staff. What do you see as some of the first steps that organizations might take as they move towards that change, and not just thinking about progress? Because I think you're right, and I've experienced that even in conversations, even recently, with people who, as we talk about progress, there's a little bit of a weariness about progress, that what they really want is change, and that resonates.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'd say a few things. First, I tell my sons all the time, I have 2 boys that are 15 and 13. I've said the following to them since they were little boys, that, Winston Churchill, to paraphrase, once said that courage is the most important virtue because it's the one that makes all the others possible. Mm-hmm. And so one has to be courageous to have hard conversations, because you can't fix what you don't face. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
So I asked your actually, I think I sent around a sermon, but did I send around the Growing in Grace
You
remarks?
did. Yeah, you
Recently?
sent,
Right.
yep, your Time
Right.
Magazine article and the sermon.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so there was a fair amount of concern amongst some here when I made those remarks. What's going to happen? What are people going to say? What's the reaction going to be? And all of which may very well have been, may still be, legitimate concerns. But here's the thing. One way or the other, you are already defining your culture, either by omission or by commission.
Sure.
And so you have to make a decision about which way you're going to go, even if the waters may be bumpy, if not, downright treacherous in order to get to the right place. That's the first thing I would say. The second is you really have to listen. Particularly when you are called to examine or re-examine what your understanding of truth to be. Let me give an example. So Sewanee is a beautiful place. If you've not been, friends, please do come. We would be delighted to have you. Deep roots in the Episcopal Church. It looks like Oxford and Cambridge on a mountain. We've got lots of hiking. It's great. It's glorious. I wouldn't be here were it not. Everyone, people are just wonderful. And early on, I had an alum pull me aside to kind of explain Sewanee to me. He's an alumnus, as I mentioned. He has 2 children that graduated from Sewanee. He said to me, I didn't think that my children were going to choose Sewanee, but when they visited here, they said, you know what, Dad, I visited and it just felt like home. I thought to myself, really? Whose home?
Yeah.
Not my home.
Right, right.
But I've traveled the world and walked with kings, which does not mean that I am not welcome to be here. But it does mean that we need to think pretty critically about what does it really take for others besides those who've already been in certain spaces to feel as if it's their home too. Final thing I will share, something I've just recently come across. It's written by, if you've not read this book, Love is the Way, by the presiding Bishop Michael Curry. Holding on to Hope in Troubled Times is the subtitle. I was reading it over the holiday and it became sort of a morning ritual for me. And he has this great phrase in it when he said, in order to lead with love, you have to be able to stand and kneel at the same time. And what he meant by that is you have to be able to stand clearly for what you know and believe to be right, even in the face of challenge or opposition.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to kneel, metaphorically or literally, in a spirit of love such that it invites the possibility of conversation and reconciliation and reform. And that imagery of standing and kneeling at the same time, I think, is a very powerful one.
It is. Yeah.
So,
A very, very powerful image. Are there, so it sounds like you're having these conversations and success in this work at the University of the South. Are there other institutions, organizations, schools, any other places where you, as you look across the landscape, both domestically and even abroad, where you see people are having significant success in this area?
that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head who I would say is doing this work that is starting from a place of challenge
Yeah.
and has achieved or is achieving profound success. Which doesn't mean they don't exist. It's just not what I'm seeing at the moment. What I'm seeing right now are largely either places that are starting from not this level of challenge, either because, for example, Take a school like Oberlin, right? That Quaker school that has been walking this walk for a long time,
Right.
right?
Right.
Which doesn't mean that they aren't having these conversations, but they're not where Sewanee is,
Right. Right.
right?
Right.
In terms of not only just people who are on campus, but in terms of their community, in terms of where, how do we think about full equity and inclusion and diversity as a fundamental value.
Yeah.
But what I do see are lots of places that are really beginning to have hard conversations and make hard choices as a result. Whether that be Georgetown University, that has for several years now really done the work to understand the roots that's the role that slavery played in its founding and sustainment in its early days, and trying its best to reconnect with the descendants of those slaves, or a place like Princeton that finally is fully calling out who Woodrow Wilson was. Not only president of Princeton and president of the United States and governor of New Jersey, but also a rabid racist who resegregated the U.S. civil service, kicking lots of people out of it, and therefore having lifelong generational impacts on their families and their descendants, and being clear about that, right? And asking themselves, so what are the implications of this? And so all of which is not to say, and let me say this, because I know that there is a school of thought that says we're just rewriting history and we need to remember history in order to not repeat it. And of course, like, we can't evaluate people from yesterday of today's standards. First of all, I would argue this following. First of all, we are not rewriting history. We are telling all of it. All of it. Not the unseemly bits that we just rather forget because it contradicts our narrative of ourselves and who we like to consider ourselves to be, but all of it.
Yeah.
In order to fully understand who we are, because quite frankly, you can't really appreciate the depth, the height of a triumph unless you understand the depth of the trial. And really just how far we've come.
Yeah.
The second is that, particularly in the context of honorifics, place names, buildings, whatever.
Right.
The question, things are named after places not in order to remember a set of facts, but to advance a set of values.
Right.
On the assumption that a person who holds the honorific exhibited in their lifetime a set of values that are worthy of emulation by the community that honors it.
Sure.
And that's worth reassessing.
Yeah.
And third, these issues were debated at the time. The reason we had a civil war is because there was the most profound disagreement in the history of the United States of America.
Right. Right.
On this issue of who's fully human.
Yeah.
And so, going back to where I started, we are now at this point in our history because people who were excluded from the conversation for a variety of reasons are now fully empowered to participate in it. And we have to really ask ourselves, what does it take to make everybody be at home here?
Yeah. So I've observed something, and my assessment might be off on this. But I'm gonna throw something out here, and I'd love to get your perspective on this. I've observed a sort of paradox about that exists when you engage in this work. That the further you go into the work, as the majority culture, you start to look at yourself and you say, "Gosh, there's I didn't know I felt that way," or I didn't recognize I had this bias or this prejudice, or that I was acting even in a racist sort of way. And sometimes there's a guilt that goes along with that. Sometimes there is, almost even for me, sometimes it's a sadness, if you will. But it, you think that you're an ally, and then you realize, gosh, I haven't been the way that I could be. You talk about speaking courageously. Conversely, on the other side, you might have, say, the minority culture that, as they are trying to get to feel fully a part and equal and included in the work. And they start to see that, and they say, sometimes it's easy to think, well, we all think the same on this, and because we haven't had the discussion about it. But it's only when we have the discussion that you realize the person who maybe I thought we thought the same way, now I realize, actually, you held a different belief than I do. And instead of feeling like we're coming together, having that difficult conversation almost makes, it almost creates a cognitive distance that is challenging, and it creates what I have experienced at times, even a discouragement in the part sometimes of the families who want to, who want to feel included and recognized. That by having the conversation, like I said, there's almost this paradox that seems to create greater distance than bringing us together. And I don't really know how to solve that, because you can't ignore the conversation. If my wife and I don't talk about something we disagree on, it doesn't get better. So we have to talk about it. But it feels like there's a bit of a paradox when you engage in this work. I don't know if you've experienced that as a black male, or.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say, and I certainly don't suggest that I'm speaking for all people of color when I say this. I just offer my own view.
Sure.
One, as you correctly say, we are all capable of having our own biases and beliefs, and all of us need to have them continually questioned. Let me give you an example. So I was raised in the South, raised to be a gentleman, raised to be a Southern gentleman, raised to treat women with a high degree of respect, have always strived to do that, thought I had it, right? And I'm ashamed to say that it took me until my early 40s when the hashtag #MeToo campaign happened. Literally when it happened. And my Facebook feed exploded with hashtag #MeToo stories from women that I know by the dozen. Hashtag #MeToo, and this is what happened to me this time. Or just hashtag #MeToo, and that's all they could bring themselves to say. And what it led me to believe that as a heterosexual male, I finally sort of came to realize that the vast majority of women exist with a certain level of vulnerability, harassment, threat, or worse, merely as a result of their gender. That if it happened to most of us as men, we'd want to hurt somebody. And since then, right, I have gone from being what I thought was a pretty good ally to being even much more supportive and leaning in, to use a phrase.
Right.
To be supportive on women's issues and gender issues, knowing still that there are things that for the rest of my life I could try and I simply will not understand because I do not inhabit the earth in a female body.
Yeah.
Right? But as the late great poet laureate Maya Angelou wrote, when you know better, you do better. Right?
Right.
And we are all dealing with 4 centuries of a deliberate social pattern in this country. That's going to take some generations to unwind. And even then, it's not just about undoing what was, it's also about an affirmative vision of who do we choose to be. And that's going to take a lot of work and dialogues. And look, I also know, frankly, that, from a lot of my, friends who are African-American or other people of color, like, look, we are tired of educating everybody else.
Right.
We are tired of having this conversation. Why do we have to continue? And the short answer is because, you know what, that's where we are.
Yeah.
And this great experiment of a multi-party democracy is not destined to succeed unless we work at it.
Right.
And so I guess this sort of wrap it all up, right? You have to, when the moment is right, you lean into it. When it's not, you wait,
Yeah.
and you keep.
That's great advice. That I found myself saying that is the work. That's the work. That's the hard work. But it's the important work for affecting change. Going back to something you said, how do you articulate or explain the significance of initiatives related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, maybe for people who they don't yet see the importance, or they don't or value that either in their own lives or for an institution? They say, we just don't see this. We don't see this in our institution.
Yeah. I've had these sorts of conversations in various environments, in various institutions. And the way in which I kind of say is like, look, I'm a person of faith. I'm a Christian. It would never occur to me to say, you know what? I went to Sunday school once back in 1978. Father, Son, Holy Ghost, I'm good. Got it. I don't need to go anymore. Why are we still having this conversation?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you continue to engage in the tenets and understanding of one's faith, in my case as a Christian, both because you gain new insight over time, mm-hmm. and because the circumstances of your own life change, necessitating you to reevaluate what does your faith mean in these sort of new circumstances. And I think it's the same in the context of why do we have to continue to engage in matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And the short answer is because the nature of our history is inextricably intertwined with it. Right? I hear people say all the time, I'm just tired of all this identity politics. Identity politics were written into the Constitution of the United States of America. When it was made clear that blacks will account for 3/5 as a person, when it made clear the only people who could vote were property-owning white men. Right. A constitution, by the way, that was negotiated by the same people who wrote the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, right? The same people that sort of proclaimed that all men are created equal are also the same people that, the glory of it is that they wrote just words. They just set an ideal that became the basis for unraveling that explicit social order and to give us a roadmap for perfecting our union. Yeah. That's the genius of this. But it's up to us to continue to define it and redefine it. And quite frankly, I mean, it is it is the height of privilege to presume that this doesn't matter. Yeah. I think that's a great point. A very good point. What advice, we've been talking about this at our faculty level, what advice would you give a classroom teacher when it comes to having these types of conversations with students, engaging in their classroom? I guess I'd say a variety of things. One, educate yourself first. There are a ton of resources available. The Smithsonian Museum for African American History and Culture has a whole thing on its website talking about race. Great. To give kind of prompts on how to do it. The second thing is, as possible and where you can, I'd also talk to parents. Particularly if you have children of color in your school, so that they can help to share some of their experiences. The glory of children is, on the one hand, they're every generation's opportunity to start afresh. Right. And yet, on the other hand, they're also formed and shaped in large part by the environments they inhabit, both at home and at school and elsewhere. And the third thing that I would say, again, is, compassionate courage, right? That you have to be able to, look, at the end of the day, the empirical record is what it is. And for a variety of reasons, we're at a point right now where people there's stuff that people are literally just finding out that they just didn't know. They just did not know, right? Because there's certain sets of facts that were just inconvenient. Yeah. And I'll give you an example. So we have this thing called the Roberson Project here at Sewanee, which was founded about 3 or 4 years before I arrived here as Vice-Chancellor. And it's an historical delving into our history as a university. Because there are lots of people over the last 3 or 4 decades who graduated from Sewanee and said, I just love Sewanee. I didn't know all this like Confederate stuff. I had no idea, right?
Yeah. I didn't either. Until I heard you speak, I had no idea. So
Right. The founding benefactors and trustees of the University of the South owned at least 32,500 slaves amongst them.
wow,
At least.
that's a shocking number.
When the university was founded, they had pledges of up to $1.2 million to start it. Harvard at the same time only had $1 million in endowment. Where did the money come from? From the wealthy slaveholding plantation owners across the South. The largest parcel of land on which our university was founded was purchased by a man named James Armfield, who at the time was the wealthiest and most successful slave trader in the United States of America. So literally the land on which we sit. I mean, leave aside the whole other bit about the reckoning of native lands on which we sit. I mean, we sit on 13,000 acres of land. There's not so much as a doorknob on this campus right now to recognize the native peoples on whose land this originally was, let alone the slave labor that both cleared the land initially or that literally paid for it with their blood and their years of toil. And so now, all of which is not to say that everybody who has ever associated themselves with Sewanee needs to sit down in sackcloth and ashes and forever sort of feel ashamed of themselves. Right. No. But it is to say that we have to be forthright in facing the historical record and be clear about what parts of our history are worth continuing to honor and what points need to be brought into the light so that we can make clear where the boundaries are about what is worth celebrating and what is not. Because silence in the face of such facts is, on some level, at least a tacit acknowledgement that you're not prepared to condemn them fully.
Yeah. It goes back to the courage that you were talking about at the beginning.
Yeah.
So the work seems really fraught. What would you say in your own life, both personally as well as professionally, has made you uniquely suited for doing this work right now?
I read a lot of biography in my spare time. A habit that was forced upon me as a child by my father, who made me read both Conrad Hilton's biography, Be My Guest, the guy that created Hilton Hotels,
yeah,
as well as a book called Born to Rebel, which is the autobiography of a man named Benjamin Mays, who was the legendary president of Morehouse College.
Okay.
And mentor to Martin Luther King and many others. And one of the things you get from reading biography is realizing that history is not inevitable. It's a direct result of the choices that people make. Often in circumstances that were more fraught than the circumstances that we face right now. And thus it helps you to draw strength from the ancestors.
Yeah.
So that's certainly one thing that certainly helped me, is understanding not only from reading history, but also listening to stories of my own family, that it helped to break down barriers, often at great cost.
Yeah.
To strengthen me to enter the fray, as it were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
Well, this has been an excellent conversation, and it truly is a pleasure and an honor to hear you talk, to share about the work, to share about your experience, to share the wisdom that you've gained through your life, as well as I think the honesty about the challenges that lie ahead. I guess the question I would wrap up with is, when you think about our country and where we are, what makes you hopeful?
Well, let me say one thing before I answer that, because I know that as you enter this work, there is a school of thought, as some people believe, that all this is just a bunch of woke socialist programming, and that if you don't think one way, then you're a virulent racist, and that's just another form of kind of liberal tyranny. I don't accept that view. In everything that I try to do, perhaps it's my training as a diplomat and maybe it comes from somewhere else, right? You're always trying to find what is at least that small center of commonality that you can agree on. Understanding, like in a Venn diagram, there may be lots of other portions that you may not see eye to eye, may even sort of viscerally disagree upon. But how can we reinforce the intersecting center? For example, do we agree that everybody is equal, to be treated equally before the law? I think as we sit here in 2021, the answer is yes. The answer would have been no in our lived lifetimes, in polite society.
Yeah.
And it took a lot of effort and sweat and pain and death just to get to that one sliver of recognition that everybody's humanity is worthwhile.
Yeah.
And so you start from there. And what makes me hopeful is that, notwithstanding our long journey as a country, what I've just articulated, that interlocking center, on that point is bigger and stronger now than it has been at any other point in our history. And that, I think, gives us the basis to continue to build, as I say, to make a more perfect union.
Yeah. Thank you. I believe that's true. I feel that. I feel that in our society, our country. I feel that here at our school, too. So Thank you very much. Well, it's wonderful that you get to be the person who has wrapped up this series with our school. I certainly wish you all the best in the work that you're doing at the University of the South. It makes me, as a secondary school administrator, encouraged and excited to know that there are institutions like the University of the South that our students can go to, and that they're going to learn the whole truth about the world, and be empowered to truly make change within their communities and within our global society. So I'm grateful for that, grateful for your leadership.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
God
thank
bless.
you. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Take care.